If Putin senses weakness in any way, shape or form, he will exploit it.
I also don't think he is suicidal. He sat at the end of a 10-meter table during COVID to avoid getting sick.
NATO doesn't want to escalate this into World War III.
The next one will be in Kyiv. What's the international community going to do?
Hello, I'm Bill Browder, and welcome to the show where we delve into the mind of Vladimir Putin. In this series, I'll be speaking with the people who know his story, who've lived the consequences of his actions, and who understand how he works. This is Inside Putin's Mind. I'm Bill Browder. In this episode, we're going to be exploring how this war might end and asking the question everyone's been asking since the war began a year ago. Will Putin use a nuclear weapon? I'm now joined by former British military intelligence security officer Philip Ingram. So the big question that everybody asks is, will Putin use nukes?
It's a difficult one. I don't think so. But there are certain scenarios where he could. However, the implications for him would be devastating, and he would know that that was the end of Russia as a player on the global stage.
In most people's opinion, he's not going to start a nuclear war with the West because that's mutually assured destruction. Correct. So this would be about a tactical nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
So set on, and what does that mean in like real terms? So what is that? What's a tactical nuclear weapon?
Yeah, everyone talks tactical nuclear weapons. There's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. It will have a strategic impact no matter what it is. And a tactical nuclear weapon tends to be smaller yield. It is limited in international treaty by its range. So hundreds of kilometers rather than thousands or tens of thousands of kilometers.
So would Hiroshima and Nagasaki be a tactical nuclear weapon by today's definition?
No. You can dial the yield in different weapons. So you can use a strategic nuclear weapon and have it with a smaller yield, or some tactical nuclear weapons or medium-range nuclear weapons, kind of a bigger yield. If you look at where the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs came from and the way they were delivered at that particular time, they'd have been considered a strategic act. However, the tactical nuclear weapons, during the Cold War, every British or Allied exercise that happened in Northwest Europe, the final few days were done under chemical, biological, and nuclear conditions, with the final exchange being going nuke, and starting off with tactical exchange that then escalated. Typically, a tactical nuclear weapon will be about a kiloton. So you're talking of immediate damage area, 1 square kilometer, radiation, another damage out to about 10 square kilometers. So this is still quite big, but the political ramifications of it are strategic.
Walking through this scenario, they throw a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield of someplace they want to.
No, I don't think they'll use it. And this is where, as soon as you start saying tactical nuclear weapons, a lot of the military commentators come out and say it'll have minimal battlefield effect. It'll not do that, and all the rest of it. Putin wouldn't waste a tactical nuclear weapon on something to try and get an advantage in the battlefield, because he's lost much more. The sort of scenario would be, he's got himself to a point where it's a stalemate. He knows he's going to be completely defeated in the field. He's got a negotiating point. He's got Europe split in, and that's something he's trying very hard to do, and knows that there's a degree of international support for a peace treaty. However, Zelensky's going for it, and Zelensky is just in the process of being able to push him. Putin is, his relationship with China is not as strong as he'd hope, and this is all theoretical. Relationship with India, Pakistan and Iran is not exactly where he wants, and he needs to stop this now. So what he does do is he gets a small tactical nuclear device. He fires it into somewhere where there's no population or minimal population, maybe over the Sea of Azov, maybe into the Black Sea, maybe into forest and land and all the rest of it. And that gives you your typical mushroom cloud. And then turns around to Zelensky and turns around to the international community and says, negotiate, peace deal, I keep Crimea, or I keep this. The next one will be in Kyiv or Lviv. What's the international community going to do?
Well, I don't know. The idea that we would sort of capitulate to nuclear blackmail seems like it has grave dangers far beyond Ukraine. I mean, so North Korea could do that.
Correct.
Pakistan could do that.
And therefore, this is why, I think there are scenarios where he could use it, but I don't think he will, because he knows that the West cannot let him get away with that sort of level of nuclear blackmail.
Okay, so
but it's very dangerous. Once you've got one foot on the escalation ladder, you can go up that ladder very quickly indeed.
So I've heard General Petraeus saying that the moment he uses a tactical nuclear weapon, the entire electricity grid will go out in Russia and the Black Sea fleet will be sunk. Is that realistic, or what is your analysis? What the West can't do nothing. What does the West do if the nuclear red line has been crossed?
I think if and I like General Petraeus a lot, but I think if we attacked Russia per se as our immediate response to Russia's use of a tactical nuclear weapon inside the geographic boundaries of the Ukrainian conflict, that would be a level of escalation that under the Russian constitution would be considered an existential threat to Russia. So Russia can then go up the escalation ladder and go for more strategic exchange, and they've got the authorizations to do that under law and everything else. I think a more sensible response from the West would be, and I'd be surprised if this wasn't programmed into all of our targeting computers and everything else now, would be a massive conventional response to destroy every piece of Russian equipment, every Russian base, every Russian unit and formation that's inside the internationally recognized geographic boundaries of Ukraine in one go. And we would see Western air, we'd see Western missiles, cruise missiles, and all the rest of it in. And at the same time, that would be fair game for Russian aircraft, Russian ships, or anything else inside the geographic boundaries of Ukraine, including Crimea. And they would go within, the first attacks would come very quickly indeed, and it would all be destroyed within a couple of weeks maximum.
And what would that do then?
Well, that puts the ball back in Putin's court as to what he does next. A conventional response is something that potentially international partners would sign up to. I don't think it could be a NATO response, because I think trying to get a quorum in NATO and to get an agreement for NATO to do it would be potentially take too much time, and that would just play into Putin's hands.
So who does it?
So I think it would be a coalition of the willing, and the coalition of the willing, we've already seen who's supplying weapons into Ukraine rapidly with the sort of political backing that they've got in their different countries. So US, UK, Scandinavian, the Baltic countries, Poland.
So we enter the war in Ukraine at that point?
We would do. And that's the danger, because once we've got...
Isn't that the escalation that everybody has been trying to avoid?
It is. But I think if we didn't respond to nuclear weapons being used in an exceptionally robust way, because of the implications that would have on fallout then coming into NATO countries and all the rest of it. So it could be used to trigger an Article 5. And Putin only responds to power. If Putin senses weakness in any way, shape or form, he will exploit it.
If the Ukrainians were to have the same type of glory as they had in late summer last year with more territory, at what point does it really start to look like a loss for Putin, that where he just, the momentum completely changes for him?
Well, I think the momentum's completely changed for him at the moment. If we look at it from a strategic perspective, his strategic goals were to stop Ukraine from getting closer to the West and to NATO, and to bring them back under the fold of the Soviet Union. A deliberate slip of the tongue, but Putin wanted the new Soviet Union under his leadership. And what's he done? He's caused NATO to expand, because we've got Sweden and Finland have come in. He thought he'd fracture international resolve. He hasn't. He's brought the international community closer together, and he's moved Ukraine even closer to the West, because we're supplying him with Western weapons and lots of Western money. And they've been given sort of application status to join the EU. That doesn't mean they're actually going to get in, but it's there. So he's failed strategically. He failed militarily in his initial operations to try and topple the Zelensky government and capture Kyiv. And he then had to change his main effort from that to going round to the east to capturing the disputed Donbass region and keep that land bridge from Crimea up into Russia. And he had been quite successful at that, but only because I think the Ukrainians were giving up the ground to buy time to defeat the attack into Kyiv, to have the Russians pull out of the northeastern part of Ukraine, and then to get themselves ready to start a counterattack. And they've done two major counterattacks, the Kharkiv region in the northeast, and then Kherson later, where they've taken two big bites out of the territory again. And I think Ukrainians will get ready to take another big bite out of Russian territory again, to say that we're back and we're ready to go, and then potentially carry out a bigger operation to try and split that land bridge. Maybe go down from Zaporizhia down to Mariupol and down onto the coastline. And I think if they split that from the Russian perspective, and they've got the ability to protect their flanks and everything else, we might see a collapse of the Russian defenses inside that mainland part of Ukraine.
And my final question is, maybe we're thinking about this too simplistically. We're thinking just conventional, just nuclear. Is there something within the continuum? Could they blow up a nuclear power plant? It wasn't us, it was the Ukrainians. Can they use chemical weapons? They use them in Syria. What else could they be doing that would be so horrifying where we haven't quite thought that out?
They could do. The chemical weapons unlikely. In Syria, they turned a blind eye to Bashar al-Assad using his chemical weapons. Russia, and this has been inspected as much as it can be under the international law and the Chemical Weapons Convention, have destroyed their chemical stocks. So they don't have many. And a chemical weapon is it's not particularly effective on the battlefield, especially when you come into the summer months and all the rest of it. It's good as a weapon of mass effect rather than a weapon of mass destruction, because of the horrors that are associated with it. So I don't think they'll go chemical. Yes, they could carry out a false flag on a nuclear power station or something else, but then they haven't done so far. And what's that really going to achieve? Where Putin is having some real success at the moment, and has had success the whole way through this conflict, is in the information domain. And it's that information warfare that he's getting out and trying to split the international support. And I think what Putin will want to try and do is to hunker down, to make the war extend out as long as he possibly can, as he did in Syria, start destroying the bits and pieces of land to hold the Ukrainians back, and then split the international resolve so that you get this Ukraine fatigue setting in. And it's already setting in some European countries and other countries around the world. And even in US politics, we're seeing it in the differential there is between the Republican Party view and the Democratic Party view of support to Ukraine. And remember, we've got US presidential elections just coming up, we've got UK elections coming up, we'll then have other elections coming through Europe. If Putin can hold out to then and continue to wiggle the fracture lines that will come in with these different elections around the place, he could get to a stalemate. I don't think he's going to win, but I think he would see a stalemate as good enough for him at this stage.
Philip Ingram, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The threat of nuclear war surely threatens the lives of Ukrainians more than anybody else. I'm now joined by The Sun's defense editor, Jerome Starkey, who's calling in from Kiev. Jerome, thanks for joining the show. One of the biggest questions of this whole conflict is, how does Putin escalate, and could it escalate to something catastrophic like a nuclear bomb? You're on the ground in Kiev. I guess, first of all, what do the Ukrainians think about the possibility or the probability of a nuclear attack from Russia?
Well, I think the horrific doomsday scenario of this escalating into a nuclear war, into a nuclear World War III, is in the back of everybody's minds. They know that Russia is a nuclear armed country, and they know that that is the nightmare scenario. But I think at the same time, there's a realization here that the fear of Putin escalating potentially works in Russia's favor if it inhibits Ukraine from fighting back, and if it inhibits Ukraine's Western allies from giving Ukraine the means it needs to fight back. So whilst I think it is a possibility, I think the sort of sensible analysis is it remains a vanishingly slim possibility.
And so I guess the big question that I have is, if you look at the wargaming, the whole scenario, if Russia were to launch a nuclear attack, what do they achieve? I mean, does that actually accomplish anything for them?
I think that, there are different types of nuclear attack, but ultimately it's hard to see how Russia would benefit from a nuclear war. The worst outcome of a nuclear war is the mutually assured destruction that comes from an exchange of nuclear weapons between the nuclear powers, obliterating Russia and obliterating the West at the same time. There was talk earlier in the war of how they might want to use tactical nuclear weapons. These are smaller nuclear weapons that, instead of annihilating the entire city, might annihilate a sort of much smaller area. These are weapons that might be used to take out a military unit or a small town or a hamlet. But the consequences of that would be immediate and severe for Russia. I mean, it would sort of trigger even more international outrage. I think whatever lingering support Russia may still have from its lukewarm allies would likely evaporate.
If nuclear weapons are used, NATO can't just sit back and do nothing, or Western countries can't sit back and do nothing, because if somebody uses a nuclear weapon with no reaction, then other people who have nuclear weapons will then feel free to use them. It seems like there has to be some type of reaction by the West. Perhaps if a tactical nuclear weapon is used in Ukraine, it wouldn't be a nuclear response, but I would imagine there would have to be some type of, at least very serious conventional response. Would you agree with that?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think you're right. I think if there was a nuclear weapon here, it would trigger absolutely, not only that sort of revulsion and condemnation, it would trigger a military response. Whether that response would be more, whether we would see NATO partners sort of actively engaging the fight, I'm not sure, but it may well be sort of empowering the Ukrainians to do even more, or giving them, the means to hit back even more severely. Although, having said that, it does feel like we've reached a point in the conflict where the West has given so much and so many advanced military capabilities that the next steps, the next rungs up the ladder, are actually really difficult. So yes, the West would respond. NATO, Ukraine's allies would inevitably respond. It's not clear to me whether I think it's unlikely that they would engage. They'd be very reluctant still to engage in the fight directly, because NATO, doesn't want to escalate this into World War III.
Jerome Starkey from Kiev, thank you very much for joining the show and sharing your insights. I'm now joined by retired Army Lt-Gen Ben Hodges. General Hodges, thank you for joining. The big sort of trillion-dollar question here is, right now Putin is fighting a conventional war with Ukraine, and we're fighting back. We're helping the Ukrainians in every way we can. But he's got the trump card. He's got nuclear weapons. Ukraine doesn't, and will he use them? Can he use them? And if he does, what happens?
Well, of course, he does have thousands of nuclear warheads, and clearly they don't care how many innocent people they killed, as we've seen all this year. But I think there is almost zero chance that he would use a nuclear weapon. First of all, he doesn't have the trump card. We're a nuclear power also, and he understands that. I think that the Kremlin recognizes and accepts President Biden's warning of catastrophic consequences should they use a nuclear weapon. Number two, there is no advantage for them if they use a nuclear weapon. It won't change things on the battlefield that would give Russia some sort of breakthrough opportunity. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union, of course, had tactical nuclear weapons for the purpose of blowing a gap in NATO defenses. And then they had trained mobile forces that were properly equipped to operate in a contaminated environment where they could then blow through this gap that was created. That doesn't exist anymore. There is no force to exploit, even if they did decide to use it. And so I think, all the risks are, there's no positive outcome for them should they use a nuclear weapon. And I think also President Xi has communicated to the Kremlin, do not use a nuclear weapon. And then finally, Bill, I think the people around him, these are not saints, but I think that they're imagining life after Putin. And so if they allow him to do this, then I think they know they can forget any hopes they ever had of getting back to their apartment in Mayfair or getting their yacht out of impoundment.
So let's talk a little bit about the Western response. So, because this doesn't just have implications for Russia. It has implications for everywhere. If they were, assuming that your prediction is wrong, and they were to use a tactical nuclear weapon, I think I 100% agree that nobody is stupid enough to enter into a nuclear war with the West, because that's why no one does, for mutually assured destruction. But Putin is a guy who, I never thought he would invade Ukraine in the first place. I guess it didn't make sense. He's a guy who doesn't necessarily follow our logic. If he were to explode a nuclear weapon in some region of Ukraine, what would happen the next day, in your estimation?
So this is a fair point and a fair question. I don't assume he follows our logic or the same sort of logic train, but I also don't think he is suicidal. I mean, he sat at the end of a 10-meter table during COVID to avoid getting sick. That doesn't sound like a guy that is suicidal. And I also, of course, as you know, this is not a one-man show. One guy can't just pull out his desk drawer on a bad day and say the hell with it and punch a big red button. It would take, even for a strategic nuclear weapon, which obviously he would not use, those are the ones that are aimed at us, there would still have to be a group of people around him to go through the process that was designed to prevent that, just like it is for us. The tactical nuclear weapon actually requires a lot more people to be involved in the process, and it's a much slower process. You've got to get the weapon out of storage. You've got to move it. You've got to connect it to an aircraft or artillery there's so much more opportunity for us to know exactly what's happening and to prevent it, to warn them. And a whole lot of people would have to be agreeing to do this. So again, that's why I think it's unlikely. But let's assume I'm completely wrong here. What would happen? Well, of course, that's the test. President Biden has said catastrophic consequences. I think that would mean some sort of kinetic strike against Russian forces inside Ukraine or in the Black Sea, not inside Russia. There would be no need to use a nuclear device of our own, because we could achieve that kinetic effect using a variety of other systems that would, let's say, destroy what's left of the Black Sea Fleet.
Is there any chance that we didn't do that? It's sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't type of situation. I'm more worried about damned if you don't, because that would send the most horrific message if we capitulated on that. But is there a chance that we didn't?
Yeah, I would say that we're not damned if we do, but we are absolutely damned if we don't. If we gave in to nuclear blackmail, then the whole idea of nuclear deterrence is done. And Iran, North Korea, China will walk away from this having realized that the United States is not able to deliver catastrophic consequences in response to the use of a nuclear weapon.
So we've now spoken to three real authorities on military tactics, on nuclear weapons, and what's going to happen next in Ukraine. Everybody is pretty consistent that if Putin were to use nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, I should say, that would be sort of the end of his military adventure. And that should be the reason why he doesn't. And I agree with that. However, I also thought at the very beginning of this war that he wouldn't invade Ukraine because it would be a quagmire and a disaster, that if he had looked at his own capabilities, he wouldn't have done that. And he did. And so I think that it's a low probability scenario, but it's not a no probability scenario. Putin doesn't always behave in what seems like the most rational way. We can all hope and pray that he doesn't. And I'd like that to be the base case, but it's still something he could do. That's all we have time for on this episode, and it brings us to an end of the series, Delving into the Mind of Vladimir Putin. My thanks to today's guests, Jerome Starkey, Philip Ingram, and Lt-Gen Ben Hodges. And I'd also like to once again thank all my guests throughout the series. And lastly, thank you for watching. I'm Bill Browder, and this was Inside Putin's Mind.